From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. In Paris, as the results of the second round of the French elections came in, the crowds that had gathered erupted. Fireworks went up, people cheered and chanted, and women in headscarves could be seen hugging in relief. It was a triumph for the centre and the left, as the far-left leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, told a crowd of supporters.
Un magnifique élan de mobilisation civique s'est affirmé.
A magnificent civil mobilisation has taken hold. Our people have clearly rejected the worst-case scenario. Tonight, the national rally is far from having the majority that was predicted.
For the far right, who thought they were on the brink of power and about to form a new government, it was a blow. But as Marine Le Pen warned, her party would be back.
We're losing one more year of unregulated immigration, one more year of losing purchasing power, one more year of increasing insecurity in our country. But if we need to go through that, that is what we must do.
So what happens now? Who can actually form a new government? And how long until Le Pen is back? The story today, how the far right lost in France. Peter, would you mind just starting by reintroducing yourself to our listeners?
My name's Peter Conradi. I'm based in Paris as the Europe editor of the Sunday Times.
Peter, we spoke at this time last Monday. At the time, there had been protests in Paris overnight because the far right had done so well in the first round. Last night, there were celebrations. What a difference a week makes. Just explain how France sort of swerved what looked like a certain far-right victory. Just talk us through what were the results in the end of round two?
Well, let's say the results of round two were completely unexpected. They were completely unexpected for me. They were completely unexpected for the pollsters. And they were completely unexpected, I think, for most people in France. And that was that we had the first round, the right-wing, far-right national rally got by far the largest number of votes in that first round. Then we came to the second round and, surprise, surprise, the winner, at least in terms of seats in the National Assembly, the lower house of the French Parliament, has been the left, something called the New Popular Front, which is a kind of a temporarily put together coalition of the socialists, the communists, the Greens, and a far left party called France Unbowed. They ended up with 182 seats in Parliament, with Macron's bloc, President Macron's bloc, actually in second place with 163. And the National Rally, who we thought was going to win, who we thought might even get an absolute majority, ended up with just 143.
And Peter, I love how in France you have the communists and then you have the far left. But as you said, those were the numbers in terms of seats. But in terms of votes themselves, how did the far right do?
Well, in terms of votes, the far right actually did rather well. In the first round, they got 33%. In this second round, they actually got 37% of the votes. So they got more votes, while the vote for the left bloc, the New Popular Front, that actually went down, because in the first round they got just over 28%. This time round, they got 25.8%. Really quite perverse, but it just shows how the French electoral system, rather like the British electoral system, doesn't always reflect in terms of seats the number of votes that have been cast.
So in terms of seats they've won, in terms of the popular vote, actually the far right did better than in the first round. Will there be a bit of upset about that? Will people be quite annoyed at the electoral system not reflecting that?
Well, let's say the National Rally itself is very, very annoyed indeed. Jordan Bardella, the man who was hoping to become prime minister, Marine Le Pen, who's the sort of essentially the boss of the party, they've both railed against the electoral system, but there's very little they can do about it. That's just the way that the electoral system works.
What have they been saying? What has the reaction been?
Well, the mood at what was intended to be the National Rally's victory party on Sunday evening was very, very grim indeed. They were expecting to have won this election. And when the exit polls came through just after 8 o'clock French time, there was slightly muted reaction.
Le Rassemblement national réalise aujourd'hui la percée la plus importante de toute son histoire.
The National Rally has today achieved the most important breakthrough in its history. Sadly, the alliance of dishonour and the dangerous electoral arrangements made by Emmanuel Macron and Gabriel Attal with the parties of the far left deprive tonight the French of the politics of redress that they had overwhelmingly voted for, putting us first in the European election and after the first round of voting last Sunday with roughly 34% of votes casted.
They had expected, I think, so much to win that, they had put a lot of serious work into drawing up a cabinet. They'd been behind the scenes. They'd been sounding out people, not just from their own party, but from also sort of non-aligned people to serve in what they were hoping would be their first government.
Wow.
And so, they were faced ultimately with a slightly odd situation because in terms of votes, they had done very, very well. And certainly compared with their result in the previous election in 2022, they'd also increased their number of seats quite considerably because they'd gone up from just 88 to 143, which by any measure would be seen as being a great result for any party. But compared with expectations, they'd done a lot worse than expected. Marine Le Pen, obviously, trying to put a positive spin on what happened, saying our victory has only been delayed because everyone here is looking forward to the 2027 presidential election because it's the president in France who wields, considerable power.
I'm not disappointed. I've got too much experience to be disappointed. I'm looking at the results keenly, coldly. I see that our number of MPs has doubled. Today, the National Rally is the largest group, the largest party in terms of number of MPs.
So for Marine Le Pen, this is, we didn't win tonight, but this prepares the ground for the presidential election and the next parliamentary election, which will come with it. But for their opponents, this just shows that the National Rally can be stopped if everyone else gets together and joins forces against them.
Was it also partly, though, because of Le Pen's party itself that they've lost some of these seats? The additional scrutiny, the sense that perhaps they hadn't detoxified their brand enough?
Yes, it was. I mean, Marine Le Pen's great achievement, I think, has been that since taking over the party from her father just over a decade ago, she has embarked on this policy of what you rightly called detoxification, which is essentially taking a party that was very much on the fringes of French politics, dragging it towards the mainstream, getting rid of some of the more unsavory far-right characters that used to play an important role in the party, including her father himself, whom she sort of rather brutally pushed aside. And, that policy over the years has proved an enormous success in increasing, in election after election, the share of the votes that her party has got. However, in this election, there were problems because, on the one hand, they fought a very, very disciplined campaign. They fought on increasing the standard of living by cutting taxes on fuel, essentially, on household bills, on curbing immigration, and on taking a tougher line on law and order. However, a number of their policies on immigration just went too far for mainstream French voters, I think. And then secondly, as is often a problem for parties like the National Rally, they had a number of individual candidates with very, very unsavory views, views that came across as sort of overtly racist, completely unacceptable to mainstream opinion. These were all picked up by the French media, which is relatively hostile to the National Rally. And that again confirmed the impression that despite the sort of the smiling facade that Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella have put on the party, among the ranks of the candidates, there were some people with just very, very extreme far-right ideas.
For Macron, is this vindication, this result? You know, even a week ago we were saying it was a mad gamble for him to call an election now. Will he be able to justify it?
I think in looking at how Macron has come out of this, we have to also bear in mind how and why we've just had this election, because the French Parliament was due to sit until 2027. There was no obvious need to have an election. That changed because of the result of the vote for the European Parliament on June the 9th, which the National Rally won. This didn't have any obvious constitutional implications for France because it was just the European Parliament election. Macron, however, seized on it as saying we need clarity in this country. We need to go to the French people and get their opinion on who should be running the country. His hope, obviously, was to kill the National Rally. He could see that it was rising in support, and he wanted to go to the French people and say to them, look, do you want the National Rally to run France? Yes or no? Hoping that the answer would be no. And after this second round, that result does appear to be no. The problem is that the people haven't said very clearly who they do want to run France. As we're talking here now, Gabriel Attal, the Prime Minister, has gone to the Élysée Palace to tender his resignation to President Macron.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight a new era begins, a new era for our nation. Starting tomorrow, the power will be in the hands of the Parliament, in the hands of the nation's representatives, and therefore in the hands of our citizens.
Macron has asked him to stay on. He hasn't, for the moment, to ensure the stability of the country. That's how the Élysée Palace has put it in a very short statement. So we're in a situation now, I think, where no one quite knows what's going to happen next, and that includes Emmanuel Macron himself. So I think he was a feeling that he wanted to shake things up, and he wanted to, I think, confront the National Rally once and for all, because his main concern is what happens in 2027 when his term ends. There's a new presidential election. He can't stand again. And the question is, will Marine Le Pen become the next president, which is something he obviously desperately wants to avoid. Which brings us back to the situation now, which is how does he actually form a government that will have a majority in Parliament? He has the right, or the obligation even under the Constitution, to choose a Prime Minister. But that Prime Minister has got to have the support of the majority of members of the Parliament, because if they don't have that support, the Parliament can simply call a vote of no confidence in them.
Just talk us through the potential scenarios of what happens now. Who might be able to form a coalition to govern?
If you look at the numbers, there is one logical solution which jumps out, but which would be quite difficult to achieve. And that is that you take the Macron bloc, and they've got 168 seats out of the 577. So it's quite a good sort of starting point. And you add to that bloc some of the parties on the left, i.e. probably all the parties on the left, apart from the France Unbowed party, which is the far left party. You also add in some members of the centre-right from the Republican Party, and you could easily reach the magic figure of 289, which is what you need for a majority. And you would need a prime minister under which all those diverse people would be prepared to serve. That could perhaps theoretically still be Gabriel Attal, who is the outgoing prime minister, and who is broadly liked. He's a popular figure. Or perhaps you could take someone from the Socialist Party. There's been quite a lot of talk in France about a socialist politician called Raphael Glucksmann, who led the socialists to a very, very good result in the European elections. Perhaps one could suggest he could be the prime minister, with Macron's group and some of the Republicans serving underneath him. That would work arithmetically, but it's difficult for Macron to get to that point because convention dictates that he should actually go to the largest party, or perhaps in this case, we'd say the largest bloc first, to get them to put up a prime minister. The trouble with the plan that I've outlined is that so far, at least, the left bloc is saying that they're not going to be divided up in that way. This is not just Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the French Jeremy Corbyn, as he's always called, the leader of the France Unbowed party.
It's a huge relief for an overwhelming majority of people in our country. Those who make up the new France, like those who have always loved it with a Republican passion. These people felt terribly threatened. Now they can be reassured. They have won.
He has said, we, the left bloc, have all campaigned together under one programme, and which is quite a radical left-wing programme, which is going to involve billions and billions of pounds of extra government spending. So he said, basically, we went to the voters under that one programme. You, Macron, can't just try and pick us apart. And importantly, the socialist leader has also said the same thing. He said, we all campaigned together. We're not going to be split up in that way. Macron may well indeed have to go first to the left. He may have to ask them to put forward their candidate for prime minister, which they haven't yet actually agreed on, and that's going to probably take a good few days. And then perhaps judge whether that leader could actually get a majority in parliament. And we might even see a situation where he would appoint that person, they'd go to parliament, and they would lose a vote of confidence, and we then have to move to another solution, perhaps the more logical sort of centre-based solution that I already outlined. But either way, it's going to be very, very uncertain and very, very difficult to predict.
It would be very hard for the centre-left to turn their back on Mélenchon now, having had their success, having managed to keep the national rally out by joining forces. If they did that, it would make it very hard to have a coalition to work together against the far right at, say, the presidential election coming up. Is there a chance that this might actually test those alliances very early and make it much easier for the far right at the next election?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And what we've seen so far in terms of the initial reactions is a number of people from the socialists have come forward and have said, no, we're not going to do that. We have all stood together, they would say, on a common programme and quite a left-wing common programme, which includes, for example, a big rise in the minimum wage, price freezes on certain key products, much heavier taxation on the rich, a reversal of Macron's very important pension reform that he pushed through last year. So, they would say, we're not going to betray our voters like that, because ultimately, as you say, if we do betray them like that, the left will be divided. And when it comes to 2027 and the much more important presidential vote, then we won't be able to put up a united front against the National Rally, and we will just let Marine Le Pen in.
I mean, Peter, I won't lie. From what you've described, it does look incredibly difficult to work out how anybody's going to form a coalition that can govern. Is there a danger that we're about to enter a period of just confusion and instability, which almost compares to that period after the war when France was said to be ungovernable? Could it actually end up benefiting the far right in the long run?
It's very, very difficult to predict. I mean, you should also bear in mind that we're now into July. Half the French population is already off on its holidays. We've got a few weeks to cool off, I think, to find a solution. We also have looming over Macron, over France and over Paris, the Olympic Games, starting at the end of the month here, when France will be trying to present a united front to the outside world. Well, I mean, good luck with that on the basis of what we've seen over the past few days. We're not in the same situation as we were in the period after the war, the so-called Fourth Republic, because that was a parliamentary system, and there wasn't really any strong figure who could kind of knock heads together. Here, the Fifth Republic that we have at the moment, we've had since 1958, set up by President de Gaulle, is a mixed presidential parliamentary system. Ultimately, Macron has got to find a solution that works. Ultimately, I think he probably will do. It's just there's going to be a lot of turbulence, I think, before we reach that solution. And, you know, you're right to say there are a lot of people who did vote for the National Rally. I mean, it's more than 10 million people who will feel unhappy. They'll feel that the system has somehow been rigged against them, that they've been cheated of their influence. And, you know, believe you me, they're going to turn out in very, very large numbers indeed in 2027 in search of revenge.
So, Peter, while this may seem like a temporary victory for the left and the centre, you can't write off the far right in France anytime soon.
The key thing is that France is a very, very deeply divided country. The far right support has been growing and growing over the years. We've reached now the high 30s. The question is, will it go further? Will it continue to rise, or has it reached a kind of a glass ceiling? And is that its limit? And if it has reached a glass ceiling, or even if it makes it to 40% or so, you know, we will still then be in a situation that come the next presidential election, ultimately there will be a choice in the second round between Marine Le Pen, almost certainly, and whoever is chosen by the centre or the centre-right to replace Emmanuel Macron. In that sense, then, the far right could still be kept out of power. But I think the fundamental problem in France, if you compare it with other European countries, is that there is just no tradition of compromise. Most continental European countries have a proportional representation political system which leads to permanent coalitions. They're quite used to a situation where we have the election, nobody has an overall majority, and the parties sit down and agree a common program between themselves, which they then implement, which has the backing of a majority in parliament. That's the way it works in Germany. That's the way it works in the Scandinavian countries. That's the way it works in the Netherlands and so on. In France, they don't have that tradition. They have a tradition of one party, normally the party of the president, having a majority in parliament. And so we're now in a situation where we have these three rival blocs, two of whom might try and get together, the centrists and the left perhaps, but each of those two is insisting that it would have to be on the basis of their programme. And if they don't compromise, then how do you actually rule France?
That was Peter Conradi, Europe editor for the Sunday Times. And if you missed his episode with us last week after round one of the election, do go back and have a listen. There'll be full coverage of all the politics unfolding across the channel at thetimes.com. The producers today were Edith Rousselot and Chris Wade. The executive producer was Edward Drummond, and sound design was by Tom Birchall. If you enjoyed this episode, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. It'll help others to find it. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.